Okay, continuing on, this is IB 12 review for paper 3, the Great Depression. So, the first two lectures were the causes of the Great Depression. I've seen a lot of questions about that before, and there were as many as 8. Number one was the international debt structure. You may recall that Germany had problems repaying the heavy reparations to the Allies after World War I. So the U.S. got involved, averted a disaster, and started investing in equity and loans to Germany and Austria. This money allowed them to repay their reparations to the Allies, and that gave the Allies money to pay for all of the American war material they had bought on credit. It was a nice circle, uh, but there were when the crisis hit Europe, they couldn't pay, and Hoover thought it would be a good idea to have a moratorium to let things kind of some liquidity develop after the initial panic. But politically, that was not capable. So the collapse of this system greatly exacerbated the general panic and created the Great Depression. Number two was the maldistribution of wealth. Wealth inequality increased during the 20s because of the tax policies of the Coolidge administration. Coolidge approved several tax cuts for the wealthy, assuming, of course, this would, result in investment and create jobs. But it basically made the rich richer and the poor poorer, therefore hurting consumption, hurting the demand side of the equation. At the same time, overcapacity was a problem because money was cheap, interest rates were low. The Fed initially kept rates very low. Money was cheap, and businesses were buying or borrowing like crazy to build ever more factories, even as consumption was weakening. Number four is deflation. I really am speaking about Europe here. Like the Civil War, in the Civil War, America created greenbacks to help pay for the war, to inflate the currency to pay for the war. The Allies did that too. Were very alarmed at the end and said, "Oh gosh, we got to suck all this money out of the system and return to the gold standard." That lessened the amount of economic lubrication, basically, in the European economy, leading to a state of deflation, which was another cause of the Great Depression. In America, the stock market crashed. The stock market grew grossly overvalued because interest rates were cheap. And you could buy stocks only 10% down on margin. That now has been extended to 50%. Well, extended 50% after the Great Depression. This allowed stocks to be bid up huge, far more than their actual value. The stock market crash did not cause the Great Depression, but it signaled the panic which would morph into the Great Depression. 6 is the lame Fed response. The Fed realized after the panic, oh my gosh, we created this in a way because we kept money so cheap that investment went too high, created a bubble, and now, oh gosh, we got to fix this. We got to raise interest rates, suck this money out of the system. Well, no, that would have been nice if they did that 5, 10 years before, but that's exactly the wrong thing once the panic hits. Um, in 2008 and 9, during the Great Recession, Ben Bernanke, the Federal Reserve Chairman, thought, I'm not going to make that mistake. And so he increased the money supply, driving interest rates to almost zero. And the fact that uh, we recovered from the recession and there was never any inflation is a testament that he averted a great deflationary death spiral like the Great Depression. 7 was the Smoot-Hawley tariff. Two congressmen, Smoot and Hawley, said, hey, we should raise tariffs really high. That'll lock out the foreign goods, then people will have to buy American goods, and that will bring jobs back to America. Stupid idea. Because, of course, and 1,000 economists signed an open letter begging Hoover to veto this, but he felt like politically he couldn't. Um, Tariffs went up, everybody else raised their tariffs, and international trade, already damaged by the crisis, ground to a halt, basically. So the Fed, the central bank of the U.S. and Congress, in their trade and monetary policies, both exacerbated and turned a recession into a Great Depression, many argue. And finally, the eighth cause was just post-war demographics. The World War I killed a lot of young men. who did not go on to marry and create households. Uh, the Spanish flu, influenza, 1918, 19, that killed. The biological nature of that was that it really uh, hit young people more. It killed millions more young people who did not go on to create households. And the values and mores of the 1920s. Women could be independent. They wore shorter skirts. They could wear makeup. And it might be okay to be a working woman without a family. That also affected household creation, lowering consumption potential at a time when capacity was the supply was greatly outpacing it. So, what was Hoover's response to this? Hoover was the president, elected in 28, and he tried. He did a lot of things. All of his efforts were based on the principles of associationalism. This is mutual cooperation. Hey, uh, corporations, let's get together and agree not to cut wages and lay people off. Um, let's all share the pain. But that's not what capitalist enterprises want to do. They want to, cheat and let everybody else shoulder the pain so they can increase their profit. Didn't work very well. He created something called the Reconstruction Finance Corporation to put money into the mortgage, to liquidate some mortgages to give banks more money to go make more loans. It backed several infrastructure projects, but it was too small. No one could dream of the scale in which this needed to be. Um, but and also he wanted to only lend to credit-worthy projects. Well, that wasn't really a very good idea. Um, I'm sorry, Reconstruction Finance Corporation was more about infrastructure. The Home Loan Bank Board was about creating more liquidity in the mortgage market. Uh, these were good ideas, and FDR would later do much larger versions of them, but it was just too little. And Hoover just couldn't survive the political whammy of being president during the Great Depression. And so along comes FDR to get the nomination in 1932, the Democratic nomination, and Democrats had been a big tent before that, throughout the Gilded Age. You had two brands of Democrats. You had the Southern Midwestern progressives. Think William Jennings Bryan. Um, they were social conservatives. They were Protestant evangelical in terms of their values. These were the farmers of the Midwest and the South. In terms of the economy, however, they wanted the government to be active. They wanted social justice. They wanted, think of those demands of the People's Party back in the Gilded Age. They wanted uh, nationalized banks and wanted the government to create these sub treasuries to buy grain when the prices were low, those sorts of things. The opposite were their Democratic counterparts, we'll call Northeastern ethnics. Think Jews and Irish Catholics in cities like New York, Tammany Hall. Uh, they were social liberals. Hey, don't touch my personal life. Don't outlaw alcohol, for example. It's part of my culture and my religion. However, in economics, they were very laissez faire, hands off. Grover Cleveland was a good example of this. What FDR did was to brilliantly take the social liberalism of the Northeastern ethnics and wed it to the economic activism of the Southern and Midwestern progressives and create what we call liberalism in America today. That's still largely true. So he wins and he enacts the New Deal Part 1. I won't go into all of this. Emergency Banking Act put some stability in the banking. Economy Act said let's balance the budget, which that never happened because that was the wrong thing to do. Glass-Steagall separated investment and commercial banking. Securities Act of 33 and Exchange Act of 34 basically began regulating financial markets, which had no regulation. Created the SEC, the Securities Exchange Commission, which has done a very good job of regulating securities markets. FARA, Federal Emergency Relief Administration, wanted to get money directly into the hands of the needy, something Hoover would not do. He thought it would destroy people's character. This was designed to give instant money to people. Civilian Conservation Corps put young men to work, working in national parks, building trails, things like that for a little bit of money. Civil Work Administration was a similar make work project to rebuild, roads and hospitals and schools and so forth. The two big pieces were the Agricultural Adjustment Act, paying farmers not to plant crops to get the prices up, and the National Industrial Recovery Act, which was a very elaborate version of Hoover's associationalism. Hey, you know, don't cut wages or hours or jobs, and you get a sticker to put. It didn't work, obviously, for the same reasons it didn't work for Hoover. And both of these were eventually declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, but they largely failed. Um, agricultural subsidies would continue in the form of other bills designed more for, like, protecting the environment, but the same effect. And over time, it did help stabilize prices, but at great cost. So, oh, I'm sorry, the TVA, which was a socialist enterprise, basically a government-owned um, utility, which was very successful on a limited scale, and this Western Dam building, which was great, but would take years to actually complete and have an economic impact. So New Deal one, people were like, meh, and there's a lot of pushback against it. There are populist critics. The best example, of course, is Huey Long. There was tremendous labor unrest. Labor was furious at their plight, and there were violent strikes. The first seen releases The Gilded Age. And there were these 1936 midterm elections, which went the way they don't usually go. Usually, the president's party loses seats, but in fact, the Democrats doubled down, won far more seats, and more importantly, moderate Democrats were replaced by more radical Democrats. And also the rise of third parties in the Midwest and the West. Upton Sinclair almost barely lost being governor of California, and he was a socialist, although the party they invented was called EPIC, in poverty in California. And there were other Midwestern examples too. They didn't really get much power on the national level. They did elect some people to Congress, but they controlled several state legislatures and governorships. So FDR thinks, oh crap, I better get ahead of these radical calls. And New Deal Part 2 is put together that is bigger and more progressive and more radical than New Deal 1, but not really that radical. More about that in a minute. It was driven ideologically by the economics of John Maynard Keynes, underconsumptionism. He said, look, the problem is not reducing supply. What you got to do to move the needle on this economy is to increase demand, support unions to raise wages, think of ways to put money in people's pocket, bigger projects. Um, the Holding Company Act was designed to break up monopolies, didn't really work. The Wealth Tax Act also was designed to, put more tax on the wealthy, didn't really do much. Um, the Works Progress Administration was a much bigger version of the Civil Works Administration and broader. It paid not only to build hospitals and roads, it paid actors and playwrights and photographers and visual artists to create art um, that largely glorified the working man uh, and furthered the New Deal itself. The two big acts, the two key parts of New Deal Part 2 were the Social Security Act, which created the pension system that became the platform for growing a social safety net in America, and of course the National Labor Relations Act, which finally legalized on a national level the right for people to have unions and the requirement of companies to negotiate with them in good faith. Having said all that, though, the New Deal was essentially conservative. Roosevelt still has detractors today who say that he was socialist. He wasn't. The Social Security Act was a very modest public safety net. And what he did really was give crutches to capitalism so it could get back on its feet. Um, Capitalism roared ahead in the 50s, 60s. And so essentially the New Deal was conservative. New Deal 2 sounded, its rhetoric was radical, but its substance really was not. Sort of toward the end of the Gilded Age, the Great Depression, um, the court had gotten rid of the AAA and the NRA, and so FDR was alarmed, thinking maybe what did they strike down the Social Security Act, the Wagner Act, which was another name for the National Labor Relations Act. So he proposed passing a law to increase the number of judges, which he would of course select, and this was kind of a naked grab for power, and middle class Americans who revered FDR, even they were kind of suspect about this power grab. Turned out not to be the case. People started retiring, dying, and he started appointing his own justices, and it worked out fine. So, who are the winners and losers of the Great Depression? Winners, definitely the middle class. They gained a sense of security. I would argue business was a winner as well, particularly retailers. This demand side, this focus on the demand side of the economy, um, and growing demand was obviously good for business. Um, Losers, I would say women to a degree. Look back on those Great Depression Society lectures. Women, there was kind of an anti-feminist backlash because the joblessness proportionally hurt men more because jobs dominated by women were more stable. Teachers, nurses, things like that. And many men found themselves relying on the income of a woman. And so there was this anti-feminist backlash. That's when Superman was invented. Um, a hypermasculine man whose only weakness, aside from kryptonite, is a mouthy working woman, Lois Lane, who, if she gave up that job and went home to be a mother, some man could have her job. So women took some steps forward in the 20s, half step back in the 30s. Blacks and Hispanics and Asian Americans, they were already hurt more. They had lower employment rates, things like that, and the white people who would not, take jobs they thought were beneath them and therefore for minorities, like being a janitor, they wanted those jobs when when that's all there was, and so those minorities got displaced more. I'm sorry, labor was also a winner, definitely. Um, this is a long video. Hopefully, that will get you started on getting organized and reviewing for the Great Depression.